Please be seated. All right, friends, we're going to go on a trip. Let's imagine for a moment that life is like a car trip. Now, I had a moment this morning, and I can't help, this just reminds me of this. It may or may not be helpful. But have you ever watched a little kid playing a driving video game? And they're sitting there, and you've got like this little bitty controller that they're driving with, and it's not a steering wheel, right? Right is pressing a button on this side, and left is pressing a button on this side. But as the kids play, and some adults, they're sitting here, and they have to turn right, and then they have to turn left, and they start steering with their whole body, and it's like life. And then if they're on a racetrack and it's only left turns, then pretty soon if you're watching a little kid, they'll be like, left, until they're almost falling over. Anyway, so we're on a car trip, friends, and we don't know exactly where we're going. So we pull up some directions on Google Maps and set up our phone to give us step-by-step directions in the car. This is all good, right? We're headed somewhere. We have directions, we have a car, and we have enough gas to make the trip. But as we're driving along, we get so focused on the directions and doing it right that we start to tune out the other passengers or snap at them when they talk. That ever happened on a trip? We start to forget about the destination and become totally fixated on each step and doing it right. Because we really don't want to end up lost, do we? And unfortunately, this is life. This is no trip to the grocery store. It's a long and complicated journey. So the focus necessary to follow the directions starts to take a lot of time and attention. Now, for each of us, this may look a little bit different. Some of us, I don't know any, are perfectionists, constantly seeking an ideal situation where everything falls together to make order from chaos. And if the situation doesn't do it, I will. Some of us are on a spiritual journey, but we're only ready to be seen by God when we've demonstrated our disciplined set of spiritual and prayer practices. Some of us are rule followers and find comfort and security in the structure of governing systems like the biblical commandments with their clear lines of authority. And although they didn't have cars or GPS, I think the chief priests and Pharisees seem to be a little of all of the above, based on Jesus' parable today. They have become so intent on managing this vineyard that they are overseeing, that is, the worldly practices of religion and politics, that they've forgotten that ultimately this is all supposed to be for the glory of God. In other words, they're supposed to be delivery drivers for God, but they've decided to keep the loot in the van for themselves, and they have sped off down the road. A few of us may relate to that too. Winning on this car trip, this journey, might mean collecting the most stuff. Others, and you know who you are racing their car through life so fast that the GPS directions can barely keep up. And then, of course, there's always going to be a few who are not going to stop, no matter how much one of the people in the car needs to go to the bathroom. Whichever way we approach the journey, the real fear, our worst nightmare, is the anxiety of uncertainty. We don't want to get lost. We dread hearing the GPS intone, recalculating route. We're terrified that we might take a wrong turn, get off our designated route. And then if we do, we start to quickly look to how can we fix this? How can we make up the time? How do we avoid a slowdown? In this journey of life, I wonder where God is and how do we plan to meet him? Well, I guess if we think about it, we could think about yielding to God, right? We're driving along, steering. We're driving along, and oh, look, God's trying to get onto the highway. I'll move over so God can merge in and travel along with us, right? That's a good idea. Others may be thinking, it doesn't hurt to stop and ask directions, especially when we're lost. So I think that would probably help. Say a prayer and ask God to tell us the next step. So as I considered this metaphor, I was struck by another message, something somewhat inspired by Paul's writing in Philippians today. See, when you look at Paul, he writes originally about how confident he is in all the things that he has done right on his journey, right? Circumcised, check. Israelite, check. Tribe of Benjamin, check. Law-abiding, check. Zealot, check. But after sharing all the correct turns he's made in life, Paul acknowledges that this fixation on doing it right did not help him feel closer to the goal. Instead, he offers a different approach. He says that only may I gain Christ and be found in him, not having righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but one that comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God based on faith. See, Paul is saying that his salvation does not come through what he does right, but in his willingness to surrender in faith to God through Christ. It's not what I do right. It's my willingness to surrender to God's will each day. Whew. So, who exactly is going to be driving this car then? See, we often try so hard to do it right that we miss the work of God around us on the journey. We put blinders on to block out the distractions, but when we do this, we are missing the whole point of the journey, right? Are we trying to do all this to be good, to earn God's love? Or are we living into the promise of our salvation and thus doing good in the world? Let's think about this relative to the biblical commandments for a moment. Here we find a careful arrangement of moral laws. They're fairly straightforward, but they don't stand in isolation. See, the intent of these laws is to live a life in relationship with God and our neighbors. That's that first two greatest commandments. Okay? We've talked about it before, but the first half of the 10 Commandments are about your relationship to God. And the second half of the 10 Commandments are about your relationship to neighbors. But what can happen, I lost it. Yeah. If we're so focused, however, on the rigidity of the commandments, we might find ourselves actually cutting God and the people out of it. Putting the blinders on and being really focused on the road ahead. When we do this, we have made the laws idols. That is, something we worship instead of God. The real beauty of the commandments is that they are delivered to the Israelites after they have been saved. They are God's chosen people. God has already extended the love and grace and rescued them from slavery. Following the law is not then about gaining salvation. That's already done. They've already gained salvation. The biblical laws are meant to be about living in gratitude for God's love and grace. All right, back to our GPS directions. We're following our directions, trying to find just the right combination of steps in our journey to earn God's love. Or is that why we're doing it? Are we on this journey trying to make the right turns to make ourselves worthy of grace? Are we trying to do all of this to be ready for God? But we know God offers us salvation despite our imperfections and in full recognition of who we already are. Our worthiness doesn't come from how we drive, thank goodness, but by being a child of God from creation. God then is found when we let go of trying to do it right and instead simply choose to surrender to the grace that's already there for us, just as we are. So, while it's great maybe to yield to God on the journey, and certainly we need to pause and ask directions, I've decided I like a little different model for this road trip of life. This one offers us the opportunity to pay attention to our passengers, to enjoy the scenery. Because you see, if we fully surrender to God, then the logical choice is to let Jesus take the wheel. Not just when the road has some potholes, not when we hit an ice patch, not when we feel lost in the wilderness, but every day. Remember, friends, your worthiness is not dependent on doing it right. You don't have to earn your grace. God is simply waiting for our invitation. And all we have to do is decide to sit in the passenger seat and let Jesus do the driving.